The rise and fall of Manhattan's richest neighborhood, Harlem, New York. On West 139th Street in Harlem, if you walk through the right alley gate, you'll find a sign bolted into the iron. It reads, "Private Road, Walk Your Horses." It has been there since 1893. Nobody has walked a horse down that alley in 100 years. The stables are gone, the carriage houses are gone. The wealthy white families the sign was written for never lived there at all. But the sign remains, instructions for a world that vanished before it began. And that small, absurd detail tells you almost everything you need to know about how Harlem became the most famous neighborhood in America. Because Harlem's story doesn't begin with the people who made it legendary, it begins with empty rooms. In 1811, the city commissioners who laid out Manhattan's street grid reached the farmland above 110th Street and paused. They noted in their report that it was improbable that for centuries to come, the grounds north of the Harlem Flat will be covered with houses. Harlem, at that point, had been a farming village for a century and a half. Peter Stuyvesant had formally established the Dutch settlement of New Harlem in 1658, naming it after the city of Haarlem in the Netherlands, and for the next 200 years it barely changed. Wealthy Dutch and English families kept estates along the river. Alexander Hamilton built his country home, the Grange, on 30 acres of Harlem land in 1802. The village was pleasant, rural, and miles from the bustle of lower Manhattan. Getting there required a half-day's journey by horse. The commissioners were wrong, of course. They were wrong by about 70 years. The first crack in Harlem's isolation came in 1831, when the New York State Legislature granted a charter to build the New York and Harlem Railroad along 4th Avenue. Suddenly there was a rail line cutting through the farmland, and by the 1850s, a few ambitious New Yorkers were buying lots up north as summer retreats. The Civil War slowed things down, but when it ended, the money came flooding back. The economic boom that followed the war turned Harlem from a village into a speculation. Then, in 1879 and 1880, the elevated railroad lines were extended north along 8th and 9th Avenues, and everything changed. To understand what happened next, you have to understand how New York real estate works and how it has always worked. A new transportation line doesn't just move people, it moves money. The moment the L lines reached Harlem, land values jumped. Speculators began buying farmland by the acre, platting it into city blocks, and throwing up buildings as fast as they could hire bricklayers. Between the 1870s and 1910, Harlem was the site of a massive wave of speculative construction. Single-family row houses, brownstones, tenements, and luxury apartment buildings erected in record numbers. The brownstones came first in the 1870s, with their parlors and maids' quarters and fine woodwork. The apartment buildings followed in the 1880s. The tenements came in the 1890s. And every single one was a bet that demand would keep rising, that the right sort of buyers would keep moving north, that the investment would pay off before the note came due. For a while, it looked like a sure thing. By the late 1880s, Harlem had become one of the most fashionable addresses in Manhattan. The neighborhood had its own opera house. Oscar Hammerstein, the cigar magnate turned impresario, built the Harlem Opera House on 125th Street in 1889, his first theater in the city. It was designed by John B. McElfatrick, seated hundreds, and charged up to $2.50 a ticket. Edwin Booth performed Shakespeare on its stage. Lillian Russell headlined. The cobblestone street outside still had a small country house next to the majestic theater. Harlem, in 1889, was caught between two worlds, half rural village and half Gilded Age showpiece. Hammerstein also built the Columbus Theater on the same street the following year, and he threw up 50 row houses for prospective residents. The man understood that theaters and housing were the same business. You build the attraction, then you sell the real estate around it. Columbia University opened its new campus on 116th Street in 1897. Construction began on the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in 1892. Koch & Company opened a dry goods emporium on 125th Street. 7th Avenue was becoming an avenue of serious apartment buildings, and the developers were aiming at upper-middle-class tenants, doctors, lawyers, bankers who commuted downtown on the L and came home to wide streets and views of the river. One financier, Edward H.W. Just, a German-born shirt manufacturer who'd made his fortune on Ladies' Mile, began buying parcels on 7th Avenue around 122nd Street and hired architect Mortimer Merritt, the man who designed Hugh O'Neill's department store with its famous beehive domes, to build a luxury apartment house. The Washington Apartments opened in 1883 with 30 families in residence: doctors, lawyers, bankers, public accountants, and builders, many of whom had servants living with them. Nearly all commuted to offices in Lower Manhattan by elevated railroad. Harlem in the 1880s was a commuter suburb with pretensions to grandeur, and the pretensions were not entirely unfounded. And then there was David H. King, Jr. King was one of the most prominent builders in New York. He'd built the base of the Statue of Liberty. He'd built the Equitable Building. He'd built the New York Times Building. He'd built Stanford White's Madison Square Garden. By 1891, King had acquired 2 full blocks in Harlem, West 138th and 139th Streets between 7th and 8th Avenues. And he had an idea that was ambitious even by Gilded Age standards. He would build an entire model neighborhood, not a row of houses, a community, one so fine, so perfectly designed that it would, in his own words, create a neighborhood independent of surrounding influences. He hired 3 of the best architectural firms in New York. James Brown Lord drew the Georgian Revival brownstones on the south side of 138th Street, wide, handsome, red brick and brownstone. Bruce Price and Clarence Luce designed the Colonial Revival houses in yellow brick and white limestone with terracotta trim on the north side of 138th and south side of 139th. And for the north side of 139th Street, King brought in Stanford White himself, the most celebrated architect in America, who designed a row of Italian Renaissance townhouses in dark brick, brownstone, and terracotta, with wrought iron balconies and arched entryways. The project cost approximately $1.5 million. In today's money, that's around $45 million. The houses featured dark woodwork, modern plumbing, views of City College across the hill, and an innovation that Stanford White himself designed: shared rear courtyards with private alleys gated off from the street where residents could stable their horses and receive deliveries without disturbing the front of the house. It was at the entrances to these alleys that the iron gates were installed and the signs that read, "Walk your horses." Everything about the King model houses assumed a certain kind of buyer: wealthy, white, the sort of family that kept a carriage and a house servant and a membership at the right club. King was so confident in his market that he built 146 houses across the 2 blocks without a single buyer under contract. And then the panic of 1893 hit. The national recession strangled credit, froze construction, and cratered demand for upscale housing across New York. King's speculative development failed. He couldn't sell the houses. His creditors at the Equitable Life Assurance Society foreclosed and took ownership of most of the King model houses. And here is where the story takes a turn that tells you everything about the economics of prejudice. The Equitable Life Assurance Society would not sell to black buyers. They would rather let Stanford White's townhouses sit empty. And empty they sat for over 20 years. While those houses gathered dust, the rest of Harlem was also crumbling under the weight of its own overbuilding. When the economy recovered in the mid-1890s, developers had doubled down, building even more apartment buildings in anticipation of the subway. The Interborough Rapid Transit Company was constructing the first subway line in New York, and it would terminate at 145th Street in Harlem. Speculators assumed that when the subway opened, the floodgates would burst. Every new building would fill with commuters eager to live uptown and ride downtown to work. William Waldorf Astor, one of the richest men in America, commissioned a grand apartment building on 7th Avenue between 116th and 117th Streets. Clinton and Russell designed it in the Italian Renaissance style, with a central courtyard, Gustavino tile ceilings, polished granite columns, and a Palladian entrance arch. It cost $500,000. They called it Graham Court. It was sometimes compared to a Renaissance palazzo. People called it Harlem's Dakota. But the subway didn't solve the problem. It made it worse. The line opened in 1904, and suddenly Harlem was one of several neighborhoods newly accessible from downtown. The Upper West Side and Washington Heights were booming too. There were far more apartments than renters. Block after block of beautiful new buildings sat empty or half-occupied. Rents were too high for most people to afford. The real estate bubble burst in 1904 and 1905, and landlords across Harlem found themselves holding mortgages on empty rooms. This is the moment where one man changed the history of the neighborhood forever. Philip A. Payton Jr. was born in 1876 in Westfield, Massachusetts, the son of a barber and a hairdresser. He dropped out of college and moved to New York City in 1899, where he worked as a barber and then as a janitor in a Manhattan real estate office. The janitor job gave him an idea. If he understood how real estate worked, he could build something of his own. Payton's timing was extraordinary. By 1900, the black population of Manhattan was squeezed into a few nightmare blocks in Midtown, an area known as the Tenderloin, and the older enclave called Little Africa in Greenwich Village. The housing was atrocious. Landlords charged black tenants more for the same rooms and spent nothing on maintenance. There was nowhere to expand. And meanwhile, just a few miles north, Harlem was full of vacant buildings that no one would rent to black families. Payton saw the gap between those two facts and drove a business through it. He started small. He'd married Maggie in 1899, and the two of them moved to Harlem, where Payton opened a real estate office with a partner in the fall of 1900. The business flopped within months. Maggie kept them alive with her sewing work, while Payton tried again on his own, placing ads in the black press. Colored tenements wanted. Colored man makes a specialty of managing colored tenements. His break came when he took over management of a building on 134th Street, filling it with black tenants for a white landlord who was desperate enough to take anyone's rent. The street that Payton himself moved to, 13 West 131st Street, was entirely white in the 1900 census. By the 1915 New York State census, the block was almost completely inhabited by black tenants. That was the pattern, replicated block by block, and Payton was its architect. By 1903, he'd formed a partnership with 9 black businessmen to acquire 5-year leases on Harlem properties. The idea, Payton later said, had come to him at the 1902 meeting of Booker T. Washington's National Negro Business League, a gathering that gave him access to the most powerful black leader in America and a network of investors eager to put money behind racial progress. And on June 15, 1904, the same year the subway opened, Payton chartered the Afro-American Realty Company, issuing 50,000 shares of stock at $10 each. His business partner was James C. Thomas, a mortician. His prospectus was blunt and brilliant. It read, "The very prejudice that has heretofore worked against us can be turned and used to our profit." The logic was ruthless and clear. White landlords were sitting on empty buildings. They were losing money every month. Payton would offer to fill those buildings with black tenants at premium rents, as much as $30 a month for a 4-room apartment, about $5 more than white tenants had been paying. Landlords who said yes got their cash flow back. Landlords who said no kept bleeding. And Payton collected the management fees. The white real estate establishment was furious. The New York Herald called it an untoward circumstance. The New York Indicator, a real estate trade publication, declared that black tenants should not only be disenfranchised, but also segregated in some colony in the outskirts of the city. property owners formed organizations, the Anglo-Saxon Realty Corporation, the Save Harlem Committee, pledging never to sell or lease to black buyers. The most dramatic confrontation came in 1905 when the Hudson Realty Company, a white-owned firm, bought 3 tenement buildings on West 135th Street from the Afro-American Realty Company, evicted all the black tenants, and replaced them with white ones. Payton's response was immediate and audacious. He bought 2 adjacent apartment buildings, evicted their white tenants, and moved the displaced black families right back in. The New York Times called it a real estate race war. Hudson Realty eventually sold the original buildings back to Payton at a substantial loss. By the end of 1904, Payton managed 12 buildings and owned 4 outright. Within 2 years, the Afro-American Realty Company had accumulated $1 million in assets and was collecting $114,000 a year in rent. It didn't last. Payton overextended. He took on high-interest financing to buy more buildings and couldn't keep up. In 1906, 35 disgruntled stockholders sued, accusing him of inflating the company's assets in its prospectus. Payton was arrested on civil fraud charges. The courts ruled against him. The company issued its first and only dividend in June 1907, never recovered from the bad publicity, and ceased operations in 1908. But the door Payton opened could not be closed. He continued buying and managing Harlem properties under his own name, the Philip A. Payton Jr. Company. And in July 1917, he closed his largest deal. 6 apartment buildings sold for approximately $1.5 million, the biggest sale of housing for black residents in American history to that point. He renamed the buildings after black heroes: Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, Crispus Attucks, Toussaint Louverture. A month later, Payton died of liver cancer at his country house in New Jersey. He was 41. By the time of his death, the black population of Harlem had reached at least 50,000, possibly 70,000. Other black realtors, John E. Nail, Henry Parker, both former directors of Payton's company, picked up where he left off and eventually became 2 of the most successful real estate brokers in New York. Churches relocated from downtown, bringing their congregations with them. St. Philip's Episcopal Church, the wealthiest black church in the city, moved to 134th Street and began buying real estate. The Abyssinian Baptist Church, founded in Lower Manhattan in 1808 by Ethiopian traders who refused to accept segregated seating, moved to a newly built neo-Gothic building on 138th Street in 1923. Under the leadership of Adam Clayton Powell Sr. and later his son, it grew to over 10,000 members. Between 1910 and 1930, the black population of Harlem exploded from around 50,000 to over 200,000. They came from the Deep South, fleeing Jim Crow and lynching. They came from the Caribbean, seeking work. They came from Midtown, escaping the tenements. And they arrived in a neighborhood that had been built quite literally for someone else, a place of brownstones and opera houses and grand apartment buildings designed for affluent white families who had never moved in. That mismatch, beautiful buildings, new population, a culture that had been waiting to exhale, is what produced the Harlem Renaissance. In 1919, the Equitable Life Assurance Society finally relented and opened the King model houses to black buyers at $8,000 each. The houses that Stanford White had designed for wealthy whites and that had sat empty for more than 2 decades were purchased by the black elite, doctors, lawyers, musicians, activists. Heavyweight boxer Harry Wills, Surgeon Louis T. Wright, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr., composer W.C. Handy, architect Vertner Tandy, the first licensed black architect in New York State. The blocks became known as Strivers' Row, a name that was partly admiring and partly sardonic, acknowledging the inventive machinations of ambitious people who took in boarders and worked multiple jobs to afford the address. The Walk Your Horses signs stayed on the gates. No one took them down. They had become, without anyone deciding it, the emblem of a place that had been repurposed. The culture that flowered in Harlem in the 1920s is well known. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay, Duke Ellington, the literary salons, the jazz clubs. What's less often understood is the economic engine underneath it, and the desperate economics that ran alongside the glamour. Harlem in the 20s ran on several economies at once, some visible and some not. The visible economy was 125th Street, which was Harlem's commercial spine. Department stores, restaurants, theaters, and the Hotel Teresa, which opened in 1913 as a 13-story, 300-room apartment hotel built by a German-born stockbroker named Gustavus Seidenberg. He named it after his wife. It was at the time the tallest building in Harlem, with a striking white terracotta facade, the ornamental pieces custom-made, not stock, and a 2-story penthouse dining room. For its first 28 years, it was whites only. In 1940, businessman Love B. Woods acquired the hotel, integrated it, and hired black staff and management. It became known as the Waldorf of Harlem. Joe Louis stayed there after his fights. He knocked out Max Schmeling at Yankee Stadium in 1938 and celebrated at the Teresa while thousands of fans gathered on the sidewalk below. Duke Ellington stayed there. Josephine Baker, Lena Horne, Ray Charles, Nat King Cole. Every black performer who was celebrated downtown but turned away from midtown hotels came to the Teresa. 7th Avenue and 125th Street was called the Great Black Way. But beneath the glamour ran a harder current. The overcrowding that had been building since 1910 was becoming unbearable. While Manhattan as a whole had a population density of around 70,000 per square mile, Harlem in the mid-1920s crammed 215,000 people into each square mile. Apartments designed for a single family held 3, and because black tenants were charged premium rents, typically 10 to 20% more than whites had paid for the same space, the gap between income and housing costs produced a distinctive Harlem institution, the rent party. On any given weekend, someone would throw open their apartment, hire a piano player, sell plates of food and bootleg liquor for a quarter or 50 cents, and use the proceeds to pay the landlord. The rent party was half social gathering and half act of collective survival, a way to turn poverty into a night out. The nightclub economy was its own world entirely. In 1920, Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight boxing champion, rented the upper floor of a building at the corner of 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue and opened a supper club called the Club Deluxe. It seated about 400. 3 years later, Oney Madden, one of the most dangerous bootleggers in New York, acquired the club from Sing Sing Prison, where he was serving time for manslaughter. He renamed it the Cotton Club, expanded it to 700 seats, redecorated the interior in a plantation theme, and opened it to white patrons only. Black performers were hired to play what Madden called authentic black entertainment for a white audience. Duke Ellington led the house band from 1927 to 1930. Cab Calloway followed. The performances were broadcast weekly on national radio, making the Cotton Club and its musicians famous across the country. The irony was savage. The most celebrated nightclub in the capital of black America was a Jim Crow establishment run by a white gangster. Langston Hughes, who was famous enough to be admitted as a rare black patron, described it as a Jim Crow club for gangsters and moneyed whites. He compared the experience to a zoo, white strangers given the best ringside tables to sit and stare. And Hughes noticed something else. The Cotton Club's success was destroying the smaller black-owned cabarets in the neighborhood, places where black Harlemites could actually go and enjoy themselves. The invisible economy was the numbers game. Invented in Harlem around 1920, numbers was an illegal daily lottery that grew by the early 1950s into a racket turning over tens of millions of dollars a year. The police were thoroughly corrupted by bribes. The numbers bosses became financial powerhouses, providing capital for loans to people shut out of banks, investing in legitimate businesses and real estate. One of the most powerful early bosses was a woman, Madame Stephanie St. Clair, who fought gun battles with mobster Dutch Schultz over control of the trade. By one estimate published in the early 1970s, 60% of Harlem's economic life depended on cash flow from the numbers game. When you look at all of it together, the clubs, the hotels, the literary salons, the numbers banks, the churches, the newspapers, the political organizations, you see a complete, functioning city within a city. The NAACP's largest chapter was in Harlem. Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association was headquartered there from 1916. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters had offices there. The Amsterdam News, one of the country's oldest black newspapers, was published there. A 1929 survey of Central Harlem counted 10,319 businesses, though it also revealed the stubborn asymmetry beneath the surface. Whites still owned and operated over 80% of them, with black-owned beauty parlors making up the largest single category of black enterprise. The money flowed through black Harlem, but the ownership often did not. In the mid-1920s, Harlem's population density reached 215,000 people per square mile, 3 times the average density of Manhattan. Every brownstone bedroom, every converted parlor, every subdivided apartment was full. And that density, that packing of people into buildings designed for fewer occupants, was already planting the seed of what came next. The first crack was the Depression. Unemployment in Harlem was devastating, far worse than in white neighborhoods, because black workers were the last hired and the first fired. The Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaign of the early 1930s tried to pressure white-owned stores on 125th Street, stores that took black customers' money but refused to hire black employees, into changing their practices. The campaign had modest success. Some stores relented. Most didn't. Rents stayed high, even as incomes collapsed. Families doubled and tripled up in apartments to make the payments. Landlords who were barely solvent stopped maintaining their buildings. The brownstones that had been lovingly built with parlors and maids' quarters began their long slide into disrepair. By the late 1960s, the ownership balance had finally shifted. 60% of businesses responding to surveys reported black ownership. But by then, the neighborhood itself was hollowing out. On March 19, 1935, a rumor, false as it turned out, spread through Harlem that police had beaten a young black Puerto Rican boy caught shoplifting a penknife from the S.H. Kress 5 and Dime store on 125th Street. That evening, a demonstration outside the store escalated into the first modern urban race riot in America. Modern because the violence was directed primarily against property, not persons. Over 600 stores were looted. 3 people died. Property damage exceeded $2 million. Mayor LaGuardia appointed a commission to study the causes. The commission's report, led by sociologist E. Franklin Frazier, blamed discrimination in employment, overcrowded housing, and police brutality. LaGuardia buried the report. It was published only in the Amsterdam News. The Cotton Club closed its Harlem doors after the riot. The perception among white patrons was that the neighborhood was no longer safe. It reopened downtown at 200 West 48th Street in 1936, but the magic was gone. The club shut permanently in 1940. The original building at 142nd and Lenox was eventually torn down. In 1943, it happened again. A white policeman shot and wounded a black soldier named Robert Bandy during an altercation at a Harlem hotel. Rumors spread that the soldier was dead. 2 nights of rioting followed. 6 people died. Nearly 500 were injured. Over 500 were arrested. Mayor LaGuardia called in Army troops. After the war, the exodus began in earnest. The forces were national. Deindustrialization, suburbanization, white flight. But in Harlem, they hit with particular force. The manufacturing jobs that had drawn black migrants north were leaving the city. The GI Bill helped white veterans buy homes in new suburbs like Levittown. But the same bill was systematically denied to black veterans, through discriminatory lending and restrictive covenants. Middle-class black families who could afford to leave began moving to St. Albans in Queens, to Williamsbridge in the Bronx, to Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn. Those who remained were increasingly the poorest and most vulnerable, trapped not by choice, but by an economy that had moved on without them. Robert Moses, the master builder who was reshaping New York through highways and public housing, demolished blocks of Harlem tenements in the 1950s and 1960s and replaced them with towering public housing projects. The Polo Grounds Towers, the Drew Hamilton Houses, others. The projects concentrated poverty in high-rise blocks and severed the old neighborhood fabric of shops, stoops, and streets where people knew each other. On paper, the housing was safer. In practice, the projects became islands of isolation. The heroin epidemic hit Harlem in the 1950s and grew through the 1960s. Then in the 1980s, crack cocaine arrived, and it tore through the neighborhood like fire. Addicts stole to finance their next hit. Dealers killed each other over territory. In 1981, 6,500 robberies were reported in Harlem. Buildings were abandoned by landlords who couldn't pay taxes, couldn't collect rent, and couldn't afford repairs. The city took ownership by default. By the mid-1970s, the municipality owned approximately two-thirds of Harlem's real estate. Between 1976 and 1978 alone, Central Harlem lost nearly a third of its total population. The numbers are hard to absorb. Homicide rates in Harlem surged from around 25 per 100,000 in the early 1960s to over 90 per 100,000 by the late 1970s. Unemployment exceeded 20% in Central Harlem. A 1992 study estimated that the average black male born in Harlem had a life expectancy of 64 years, dying before he could collect Social Security. 75% of Harlem students tested below grade level in reading. In the Bradhurst section, between Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard and Edgecombe Avenue from 139th through 155th, just steps from Strivers Row, nearly two-thirds of households had incomes below $10,000 a year. The brownstones on the row survived, but barely. Many had been converted to single-room occupancies in the 1940s, the original interior woodwork stripped or covered over. The landmark facades held while the rooms behind them were carved into ever smaller boxes. The Hotel Teresa, the Waldorf of Harlem, the place where Fidel Castro had rented 80 rooms at $800 a day in September 1960 after being ejected from a Midtown hotel for allegedly cooking chickens in the rooms. Castro chose Harlem deliberately, a propaganda gesture that paid off spectacularly when Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, and Malcolm X all came to visit him at the Teresa, the eyes of the entire world briefly fixed on the corner of 125th and 7th. 2 months later, presidential candidate John F. Kennedy held a campaign rally outside the same hotel, alongside Adam Clayton Powell Jr. and Eleanor Roosevelt. "I am delighted to come to Harlem," Kennedy told the crowd, "and I think the whole world should come here." The Hotel Teresa had become, for one extraordinary year, the crossroads of Cold War geopolitics and the civil rights struggle. 5 years later, the hotel was struggling. By 1967, it closed its doors as a hotel and was converted to offices. The irony was layered. The Teresa had thrived partly because segregation forced black celebrities to stay in Harlem. When desegregation opened Midtown hotels to all races, the people who had made the Teresa famous no longer needed it. Success elsewhere killed the institution that had been built on exclusion. Graham Court, William Waldorf Astor's Renaissance palazzo, fell into severe disrepair by the 1970s and 1980s. Drug dealing moved into the building. The city nearly seized it for unpaid taxes totaling $933,000. In 1979, a pharmacist named Mohammed Siddiqui bought the entire building, the one that had cost Astor $500,000 to build in 1901, for $55,000 and a promise to pay back taxes. Think about that number. One of the landmark apartment buildings in New York City, designed by architects who also created the Apthorpe on the Upper West Side, sold for less than the price of a modest car. The old theaters on 125th Street, the Opera House that Hammerstein had built, the Columbus Theater, Hertig and Siemens Music Hall, most were demolished or converted to churches. The sole survivor was the Apollo Theater, which had opened in 1934 when Frank Schiffman and Leo Brecker took over the old Hertig and Siemens Burlesque House, just a few doors down from where Hammerstein's Opera House still stood. The Apollo became the most famous performance venue in Black America. Ella Fitzgerald won Amateur Night there in 1934. James Brown recorded his legendary live album there in 1962. But even the Apollo struggled through the worst years, closing temporarily in the 1970s before being rescued and designated a landmark. The grand commercial street that had been Harlem's spine became a corridor of shuttered storefronts and check-cashing outlets. Plans were drafted in the late 1970s for a Harlem International Trade Center that would have filled an entire block between 125th and 126th Streets with a center for trade with the developing world. The plan required $30 million in federal financing. Ronald Reagan was elected president. The plan died. And yet, the buildings endured. That is the strange, stubborn fact at the center of Harlem's story. The brownstones and the apartment houses and the churches had been built in the 1880s and 1890s by men who expected them to last. And they did. They survived the bust and the Renaissance and the riots and the heroin and the crack and the abandonment. They survived because New York's Landmarks Preservation Commission designated Strivers Row a historic district in 1967, and Graham Court a landmark in 1984, and the Hotel Teresa in 1993. They survived because some residents refused to leave and refused to let the buildings fall. They survived because brownstone and limestone and terracotta are harder to kill than a neighborhood's reputation. The recovery began in the 1990s. Crime plummeted with the end of the crack wars and the arrival of aggressive policing. Robberies fell from 6,500 in 1981 to 1,700 in 2000. Private investment and federal funds flowed back in. By the early 2000s, Harlem brownstones that had been worthless in the 1970s were selling for hundreds of thousands, then millions. Frederick Douglass Boulevard sprouted restaurants and wine bars. A Whole Foods opened on 125th Street. New condominiums rose on lots that had been vacant for decades. And the people who had weathered the worst years, who had stayed when everyone who could leave did, began watching their neighborhood fill with strangers. That cycle, of course, is its own kind of irony. Harlem's original buildings were constructed for wealthy white residents who never came. Black families filled the void, built a culture that became world famous, endured decades of poverty and violence, and held on. Now the buildings they saved are attracting a new wave of buyers who can afford what the original developers always intended to charge. Central Harlem's population, which was overwhelmingly black for most of the 20th century, had shifted by 2010 to roughly 40% black, a proportion that continues to drop. On Strivers Row, those Stanford White townhouses that once sold to the black elite for $8,000 in 1920 have recently listed for upward of $3 million. The dark brick facades are largely unchanged. The wrought iron balconies are intact. The rear alleys still have their parking spaces where the carriage courts used to be. And the iron gates still carry the signs, "Walk your horses," an instruction that was irrelevant when it was installed, that was ignored by the people who actually lived there, that survived abandonment and decay and restoration and gentrification, an instruction for a version of the neighborhood that existed only in a developer's imagination in 1893 and was obsolete before the mortar dried. A reminder small, iron, indifferent to interpretation, that the place you build and the place that gets built are never the same thing. The gates are locked now. They have been for years.